Hello everyone, this is Adrian, and this is my older adult oral video presentation. So let's get started. So I have chosen Identity versus Identity Confusion in Erickson's Stages of Psychosocial Development. This stage begins in adolescence between the ages of 12 and 18, and is characterized by exploring and experimenting with social norms um, and roles and identity consolidation. So there are many life-changing experiences for my interview at this time. At the age of 12, being the oldest child, she begins to help her mother care for the household, which includes cleaning, cooking, tending to the children, taking on a role with her mother to really care for her siblings and the household. She leaves home and marries at the age of 15. So she marries a man who is 7 years her senior. Um, and by the age of 18, she's had three children, um, and migrates to the United States at the age of 19. So my interview is presented with many challenges during this time in her life. After she marries, her family moves to a city 3 hours away. She loses an infant child at the age of 17 to pneumonia. And after the death of her child, her marriage becomes strained. She struggles with low self-esteem and a negative self-image around this time. And although there's a lot going on, she's working hard to keep her marriage intact and her remaining children healthy. And again, she moves to the States at the end of the stage. So at this stage in Erickson's psychosocial development, adolescents are exploring and developing a sense of identity. They're trying on different hats and finding what works and aligns with their sense of self. This is identity diffusion. Adolescents who are unable to integrate their roles into their sense of self experience confusion about their identity. And so I'm going to go through some biopsychosocial factors that actually may have hindered my interviewee in consolidating her identity. And so she was born into a family, we'll start with socioeconomic status. She was born into a family with no money or power, and is forced to marry a man with money and land holdings as a way of securing a better life. She does confess that she may not have had feelings for her husband, but this was her way of getting out of the house and creating a life for herself. Um, I do want to disclose that this this was her predestined identity. So this was what was expected of her, uh, is to marry and be a wife and a mother to um, her kids. There was no other way for her in her mind to really create a life for herself. There was no economic opportunities, no room to dream and or think of what life could look like. This was what was expected of her. Um, and so that's what she did. She married um, and she got out of the house. Gender. And so as a woman in rural Mexico, she had to follow the rules set forth by the patriarchy, to suffer in silence or risk losing her children and her livelihood. Her family, her main support system at the time, her parents and her siblings have moved away, um, and her own little family unit is strained by the death of her firstborn. So she loses her main support system at this time, and her role as a mother is challenged when she loses her firstborn. Her relationships, her partner becomes abusive and uses substances after the death of their child, and is in and out of the home and not very present. So she's really left to deal with tending to the needs of her children, mourning the death of her child, worrying about her husband, um, all on her own for the most part, in her mind, right? Um, and education, so lack of education, economic opportunity. The highest level of education that my interviewee received um, was a third grade level education. And so again, she um, may not have formal education and this really kind of hindered her ability to explore maybe other identities, and other roles that maybe she would have liked to. Um, so she fell into her predestined role. So there was some various trauma experienced at this time, um, that hindered the resolution of the psychosocial crisis. According to Berman, trauma, the presence of trauma, and one's reaction to trauma can really affect one's own identity diffusion, distorting one's sense of self. And so after the death of her child, she has issues coping with the death of her infant child. She experiences lots of guilt and shame and anger. And it's hard for her to really think about, um, maybe any other factors besides the fact that she was the child's mother and she should have done what she could have to save him. And so for a while, she blamed herself for not being able to save her child. Her partner is also unable to cope with the death of their child and starts drinking heavily, becomes physically and emotionally abusive. And so she doesn't really have time or space to cope with the death of her baby. She then has to deal with, the abuse at the hands of her partner. And so she is now faced with staying in an abusive marriage, or risk alienation from her community, and her family if she left her husband. She felt as though she had no choice but to stay married, had no money of her own, and no other skill or formal education to make it on her own. And her self image and her role as a wife, mother, and a woman are challenged, at this time. She disclosed that it was hard to manage her predestined identity in the midst of all this chaos. That she felt she wasn't a good mother, a good wife, um, for because of what had happened, and it really challenged her identity and who she thought she needed to become. And so, existing at various intersections of identity and their interactions between various identities and her environment created a very unique experience for my interviewee and inhibited the resolution of the psychosocial crisis at this stage. Family, her family system. As a mother, she was expected to care for the household and her husband and children. She had to obey her husband's wishes. Being married into a wealthy family meant she also had to listen to the extended family's opinions and demands. Marriage at this time, and I guess to some extent continues to be seen as a sacred union that needed to be maintained regardless of the circumstances. To end a marriage was to bring shame upon yourself as a woman, and implied inadequacies in one's ability to be a good wife and mother. Lack of economic investment in rural Mexico, also may have contributed to, and did contribute to, um, the inability to resolve the conflict at this stage in her life. And so the interviewee stated that she would have liked to attend high school and received a high school education, but the government did not invest in schools and did not encourage teachers to leave the city to provide education in rural communities. Healthcare, there's also a lack of healthcare, and lack of access to healthcare. The nearest doctor was 3 hours away from where she lived, and the interviewee recognized this as a barrier in receiving adequate care for her child who passed away. And so all of these various factors contributed to a sense of disconnect between who she wanted to become and who she felt she needed to become, which was a wife and a mother, and to raise strong, healthy children. Um, and she really never had the space to think about any other options or any other roles that she may have fallen into. And managing the chaos around this time in her life, um, proved difficult, and a disconnect and discord with who she was supposed to become. And if she wasn't a good wife and a good mother, then who could she be, really? And so this was kind of where we spent most of our time talking, was around, her identity at the time, and managing that. And it's safe to say that as, she got older, she was able to reconcile who she was and her identity as a mother and as a um, to her children, and so yeah, so that's that part. Um, Piaget's formal operational stage. So this is the second theoretical framework that I'm going to be using to speak to my interviewee's life. And so this is the last stage of Piaget's theory of cognitive development and occurs between the ages of 11 and 16. At this stage, individuals and adolescents begin to think abstractly, hypothesize, analyze events and properties of objects, and use logic to work through issues. And so one component of formal operational stage that I'll be focusing on is cognitive adaptation. So cognitive adaptation is a key component of formal operation stage and has three components: schemas, internal ideas of the world and how we process information about the world around us; accommodation, changing our ideas or schema based on new information that contradicts what we believe to be true; and assimilation, integration of new information into current schema without completely altering what we previously believed to be true. And so I'm going to apply this specifically to my interviewee's ideas around marriage and family. Um, and so at this point in her time, she really owned her predestined identity of, of being a wife and mother. Um, and she was presented with, this idea that she would be able to, have a happy marriage and happy life with little to no road bumps. But when her child passed away, her partner became abusive. Um, and her idea around marriage, right, was that this you can't leave a marriage despite, any adverse or oppressive circumstances that surround it. That this is a sacred union and that she had to do whatever she could to um, maintain that. Um, and at that time, she was unable to really think critically about the consequences of staying in a marriage um, that was oppressive and abusive. Um, and she also did not have, and maybe continues not to have, a vague understanding of the various factors that may have contributed to the circumstances in her life, such as the various traumas she's experienced, social barriers, gender, class, etc. And she stated it's just the way it is for someone like me. Um, Although she eventually became separated from her husband, they never divorced. So again, she maintained her legal married status with her husband until he died. So I argue that a lack of cognitive formation may have also made it difficult to cope and manage with the various stressors, which in turn may have affected identity diffusion and led to a distorted sense of self. Um, and so her schema around marriage and family, um, being informed by traditional cultural values in Mexico, um, and having this new information of, these new inputs of an abusive husband and the chaos around marriage, and being unable to fully integrate that into her previous idea and really think critically about what she wanted and needed for her life. Um, Eventually she got to a point where she decided to leave, but at this point in her time, she in her life, excuse me, she she was unable to think critically about what she wanted for herself, and she knew she didn't want this, but her ideas around marriage and family really hindered her from making that decision. Um, so yeah. So some theory limitations, I chose Piaget's formal operational stage. Some limitations are his theories are based on observations of his own children. Studies show that this stage may not necessarily take place in adolescence, and it is likely that there are many individual differences related to formal operational stage, formal operations that are influenced by neurological changes based on individualistic experiences, and pays little attention to the ways in which diversity and oppression may affect cognitive adaptation and development. And here are my references. And that's it. Thanks, y'all.